Lovely. I just need to check if you've got any energy left. Have we got any energy left? Because you know we are the Māori of the kaupapa, and we did see a mana wave demonstration. It's even made it to the internet. We've already gone viral, everybody. So I want to reward someone. I want to reward someone unexpected. So we'll go this side versus this side first in terms of a mana wave. You don't have to get up. You can just be in your seat. But I do notice style. I notice ihi. I notice Māori. So I'm getting more giggles over here. So I'm feeling this area here is going to give us a mana wave in 3, 2, 1. See that? Oh, so we even got a whetero over here. Okay, and we'll try, and then a late backup. That's the boosters, turbo boost at the end. And then this side, 3, 2, 1. Oh, that's angry. I like that. Okay, now I have to show you something very exclusive, not yet even in your bookstores, that you could win with your best mana wave. Now this is brand new. This is brand new, Māori Made Easy Pocket Guide, Essential Greetings, Phrases and Tikanga for Every Day by Stacey Morrison. That's related to how I got hold of it. I'd say I'm his best pocket guide actually, but is it signed? No, it's just going to mark from my pen, but I can arrange it. So I am going to do now, I'm going to do one-on-one, okay. The best mana wave will receive this extremely exclusive, never before seen offer of Māori Made Easy Pocket Guide out in every good bookstore very soon. Okay, so I want on this side, 3, 2, 1. Oh, he's pretty good. 3, 2, 1. The sustainability is important here. 3, 2, 1. Oh, I can't go past whetero guy. Whetero guy with the blue shirt on, hara mai, you are our winner. Who can be extremely proud? Kia ora. Where are you from?
Taupo.
Taupo, nā whai anō. But there's another name at the bottom there.
E-Pro.
E-Pro. Tēnā pai. The dreaded spot of any keynote is straight after lunch. Everyone knows it, and so a hospital pass has been thrown to someone who can handle it. Someone who is of such high standard and standing, and also such a good speaker that he knows how to navigate his way through the afternoon post-lunch fall down. Ruatako Meneti Noiho, just 20 minutes, and then we go into quick fire rounds. So please make sure you welcome our guest who is been here quite a few times in Aotearoa and as one of the whānau, you'd have to say now. Professor Joshua Viers is the Associate Vice Chancellor for Interdisciplinary Research and Strategic Initiatives at the University of California and Merced. He is a watershed scientist with expertise in resource management and environmental decision-making and a member of the Challenges International Science Advisory Panel. So please make sure he feels very welcome. Professor Joshua Viers, tēnei ka mihi ki a koe. Kia ora.
Kia ora. Is my mic on? Thank you. Kia ora. Ngā mihi nui? Kia ora. I need the pocket guide to keep going, but I'm very grateful to be here, grateful to the Bioheritage Challenge, very grateful to the Matua for inviting me to Aotearoa. I'm humbled to actually represent the ISAP, the International Science Advisory Panel. It's something that's been going now for a number of years, but it really represents some exceptional scientists that are top in their field, but also exceptional human beings. And so I'm just grateful and humbled to be able to be a part of that community. We've grown to recognize our strengths, but more importantly, the strengths of this particular program, and to be able to add value to something as important as this. We've learned a lot, and those are things that we share with our community. So we encourage you to continue doing the great work that's been a big part of this. So this storyline around navigating the social tipping points, the socio hydrological tipping points, the socio-eco-hydrological tipping points, where we find society today. Many of you wake up and read the news much like I do, and it can be terrifying, frankly. And many of us that doom scroll through the morning is not a good way to start your day, right? And so we're in this delicate balance now with society and thinking about a future that's changing very rapidly, both in terms of our environment, but also across society. And we see things that flick across the news screen. And just today I saw that avian bird influenza in the United States had moved from cow transmission to human transmission. And we know now with the pandemic and the COVID-19 that if we discover one, there are probably many more, right? So we have to always be on our toes, and we're reassessing our values and thinking much about a future with society and the balance. And so this talk is a little bit about that, some lessons learned, perhaps some ways to move forward. I was asked to say a little bit about myself, right? Ko Joshua Viers, call me Josh. I'm the son of a thinker, a philosophizer, a wannabe cowboy poet. That was my father. My mom was more of a modern-day gypsy, a flower child of the 60s. I was conceived in the summer of '69. My parents, they honeymooned they married in Vegas and honeymooned in Haight-Ashbury in San Francisco. It was a much different era, but I was exposed to a lot of different things. I was born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, in the desert Southwest on the banks of the Rio Grande. Right, also known as the Rio Bravo, which means fierce in Spanish, and the Rio Grande is the big river. And this river is neither big nor fierce, but I think for the Spanish that were tromping through the desert, finding any water was a bit of a relief, and finding the communities that were there obviously required some adjustment for everyone. But New Mexico now is a polycultural place where native perspectives are embraced, and a long history of the Spanish presence over 500 years are interwoven into those communities, to the point where I can tell you many of their stories, whether that's the Isleta to the Laguna, the Acoma, to the Dine and the Zuni. I spent some of my first years in the Rema Dine Indian Reservation and know full well the hardship that they faced in trying to achieve the most basic things, including education. And my parents were educators, and I believe that's probably why I too am now a professor, right? Is that pathway. I'm no longer in New Mexico. I'm in California, right? So this is the land of the Yokuts and the Miwok, and over the ridges the Paiute and the Mono, and over to the coast are the Nisinan and the Pomo, right? It's a linguistic, biodiverse place in California. 500 years ago, before the Spanish arrived, was as equally magnificent as any of the other places on Earth. It was teeming with wildlife. The water was clean. The mountains were majestic. These are things that we share with New Zealand in the sense that Aotearoa has a magnificent coastline. We have mountains that are 4,000 meters that are entirely majestic. We have snow-capped volcanoes. These are things that we share with each other, right? The teleconnections across the Pacific are things that have been recognized generationally across these waters. Where UC Merced is in the center of the state is very different from those majestic coastlines and majestic mountains, right? This is where we've transformed what was a giant wetland, equivalent to the Okavango Delta in North America, teeming with tule elk and bison and salmon, that's been completely transformed at this point for industrial agriculture. And I'm going to speak a little bit more about that as we proceed, but to recognize that there are a lot of shared pieces to our story. Some of the other shared pieces to this are also global in nature. In this case, the struggle over water. This particular study was in South Africa, but basically spoke to the privatization of water, and those that have wealth can also have water. In California, we talk a little bit about water running uphill towards money. Okay. That's also the case, in this case, of not enough water, but when there's too much water. In this case, in California, wealthy landowners diverted floodwaters, this is just last year, from a huge snowpack that were melting off and were about to flood a tomato field, actually a really large tomato field, but they shunted that water off towards a community and flooded it. And these were the ones that couldn't afford to get out of harm's way, right? They were the ones in the low-lying areas. So either too much water or not enough. The inequities in how we treat each other and across this planet are things that we all share. And so to summarize some of these things, I've distilled it down to what I call the sacred cows and the water buffaloes. The sacred cows are the ones that have these untouchable beliefs and practices. These are ones that prefer to point to others. Well, what about you? What about these other people? What about everyone but me, right? The water buffaloes are the ones that have been entrenched for some period of time, and if you know much about their demeanor, they like to stay in one place and claim it as their own. But unfortunately, the popular media also promotes much of this in stories about us versus them, right? It's either farms or it's fish. Rarely is it farms and fish. It isn't presented to us in a way as which there's a future that isn't like the past. It's the inevitability of the status quo where we are today, right? These are things that I believe are universal no matter where you are. But when we look back to the Pacific and we think about this planet, the planet of water, in fact, we do share a few other things. My understanding is that El Nino is affecting Aotearoa now, that perhaps the precipitation hasn't been as high as it was historically. We're actually getting a lot more precipitation than we would normally, right? But not too long ago, there was a warm water mass over the equator that we called the blob, and it created a high pressure zone over California for which lasted years, several years, for which we experienced the most dramatic drought that's been recorded. And using dendrochronology, they think that it was the most massive drought for over 1,000 years. Those connections then across the Pacific, in our case, we refer to them as atmospheric rivers, huge volumes of water, the water mass over the Pacific and the equatorial region, moving to the coast of North America. Sometimes they come down out of the Arctic. When they come off of Hawaii, we call them the Pineapple Express, right? So they're bringing large volumes of warm moisture that hits the coast of California, Oregon, Washington, the Pacific Northwest into British Columbia, Canada. And it's much like a fire hose. It's just swinging back and forth. We're never really sure where it's going to make landfall or exactly how much water is going to be there. But what it means is that at the extremes, we can get a 10-year flood event during a dry period. This was a 5-year drought, and we had an exceptionally wet Pineapple Express that set on this. It also means that we can have these dry periods when the blob shows up. And this is during a relatively wet year, but that disconnection of the flowing waters here is exacerbated by human uses. Our overutilization of groundwater in this case has severely disconnected this particular stream from its base flow, right? So as we wrestle with human uses in this socio-hydrological setting, it poses new challenges for us, and for which infrastructure itself is rarely the answer. So you take El Nino, and you take the blob, and then you bring in mega drought. And these are the things that we face now. And I'm going to provide you with a little bit of evidence as to how we struggle with increasingly what we call the climate whiplash. This particular depiction shows drought stripes, right? So they're colored from blue if it's wet to red if it's been dry. And while it's a tapestry, in fact, it's quite beautiful if you think of it as a textile, something you might throw on your couch. But instead, when you interpret those data, you recognize that the tan colors, the ones that are in the middle, in fact, are fewer now. It's either wet or it's dry. And so these prolonged periods of dry that are the dark red are punctuated by the bright blues, which are the extremely wet, right? So this balance that used to be there historically, for which our infrastructure was actually built and put in place to be able to store water for periods of need, to be able to move it around the state and so forth, is being challenged by these increasing extremes. And the one place where we're most challenged to make this happen indeed is in the San Joaquin Valley. That's where I now live and I call home. And it's that place where we produce a tremendous amount of food. For the United States, we produce half of the nation's vegetables. We produce 2/3 of the fruits and nuts. 80% of all the almonds that are grown in the world are grown in my backyard. It's about 400,000 hectares of almonds. Think about that. It's driving for hours with nothing but almond trees. Now there's a brief moment, it's about 2 weeks when they're in bloom and it's gorgeous, right? But the rest of the time you recognize that there's little else under that canopy. There are very few birds, if any. There's nothing underneath that canopy, right? And these almonds, while tasty, nutritious, dense, have fully captivated an entire region at the expense of some other things. And we'll talk a little bit more about that too. But the one thing that I want to point out is despite being so productive, one of the most productive agricultural spaces on the planet, it's also one of the most persistently poor in the United States. The number of underserved communities in this region are pervasive. These are communities of color, and they're communities that are subject to not only low wages, mostly in this case, but also environmental health concerns. Some of the dirtiest air in America is right here. And that's generated not just by the trucking and the tractors, but the actual exposure of soil and the dust that's created from these agricultural communities. So it's a place, if you want to make a difference, it's a good place to go because there's a lot of work to be done, and that's part of the reason that drew me to this place. I'd also like to point out that this map in the red and the blue is actually runoff. That is an elevation. And so the disconnection between the amount of runoff in the state and the demand is quite large. And that's part of the reason we have as much infrastructure as we do now to be able to capture, store, and divert those waters to be able to have irrigated agriculture. But that surface water runoff isn't enough for the 2 million hectares of agriculture. In fact, we have to tap into our groundwater reserves. And where we are in the San Joaquin Valley, we've been over-tapping those reserves at 2 million acre feet a year, right? So there's about 1,200 gigaliters per 1,000 acre feet, right? So this is a tremendous amount of water that's being taken from our aquifers and not being replenished to the point that we have about 100 million acre feet of storage under the ground. That's 25 of our largest reservoirs that we've taken out and not yet paid back. It has localized effects too for these communities of color. Their drinking water wells have now diminished over 60 meters in depth, right? So the cost of actually putting in a new drinking water well for a given household is about $30,000. It's beyond the reach of most everyone. So not only do we have the environmental health considerations with our communities and the overtapped groundwater, a recent study that we just completed shows that in fact post-2011 we have a regime shift with temperature warming that is increasing the evapotranspirative demand of the atmosphere, which is a long way of saying that based on evapotranspiration of crops and crop coefficients, integrating aspects of air temperature, relative humidity, wind speed, doing all these calculations. There's about a 30 millimeter shift since 2011, so that the demand of the atmosphere to take more moisture from the land is now in a new phase. That may seem small in terms of the 30 millimeters, but if you integrate that over the 2 million hectares of irrigated land, that's larger than one of our biggest reservoirs annually, that we now need to be able to pay this invisible surcharge, if you will, in order to maintain the same level of productivity. This climate whiplash then, the periods of prolonged dry and pronounced wet, declining groundwater reserves, have forced some policy implementation. We've had to change our ways, albeit it's a 30-year glide path for our Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, right? So the politicians said, well, we need to do something, but we're gonna make it far enough out so that we won't be around once everybody has to put it into place. The thing is that we know now that amount of water that we need to stop taking in order to bring things into hydrologic balance is enough to require about 200,000 hectares of land to come out of production. And the real question now is, whose land is that going to be? Which are the farms that are going to stay? Which are the farms that are going to go? Right? And that's where human decision-making becomes important, and it's not one for which infrastructure can really help. Climate whiplash. So in February of 2017, one of those atmospheric rivers came and sat over Northern California, over Oroville Dam on the Feather River. It stayed for 3 days. Normally they stay for a day. This one stayed a little bit longer. The projections of inflow were off by 37%. It filled much more quickly than they anticipated in terms of the reservoir, right? So they had to release water on the emergency spillway, which hadn't been used in a number of years. Started to cavitate, it collapsed. And over the period of several days, it got progressively worse, this showing it eating away at the hillside. The emergency spillway, which is the backup to the spillway that you see there, was brought into play. It started eroding the front of the dam. The dam is 230 meters tall. It's the tallest dam in the United States. So what happened next? Well, 188,000 people had to be evacuated below this dam, because if that failure happened, it would have taken the entire town out. And within a day, it would have reached the capital city of Sacramento. And conceivably, had it swamped those levees around Sacramento, it could have knocked out the levees that are at sea level, which would have then created enough accommodation space so that the saline water of San Francisco Bay would have flown inward to where we have our pumps that pump water from this dam ultimately to Los Angeles. 20 million people suddenly without water. 2 million hectares of irrigated agriculture suddenly without water, right? So that very knife's edge then of climate whiplash affecting built infrastructure is very real. It was really just a matter of days before everything could have been very different. At the end of the day, it was a $1 billion mistake. We cannot buy our way out of this. It's that very infrastructure that has also affected a number of our species, including salmon, mostly salmon, including the Chinook from the McCloud River, which my understanding is they're actually doing quite well on the South Island. They just no longer exist in California, right? So if we think about the ways in which we take infrastructure and use it in a future that is highly compromised by climate and by water, we need to start thinking about other alternatives, soft paths to a future, right? When we start thinking about nature-based solutions. And in this case, I'm going to talk a little bit about some work that I presented a number of years ago. Some of you may remember that. I have some new updates that I want to share with you. But effectively, these setback levees allow us to achieve multiple benefits. So not only are you getting the flood hazard reduction, but you're also getting nutrients, you're getting sediments, you're getting propagules that are coming across this space once we give rivers room to roam. And in that previous study, I mentioned to you that the salmon, in this case, actually do much better. It's higher survival rates, right, and much faster growth rates. And we know that the bigger they are when they go out to the ocean, the greater the likelihood that they'll survive and come back to reproduce. It's a virtuous circle. These are the incubators for our salmon that have been disconnected for some period of time. So we now couple that information that we know on the ground with satellite imagery and with drones, and we can be able to estimate the amount of water, the depth of inundation, the duration of the inundation, the amount of nutrients that are there, and all of those different multiple benefits. We had some ideas about the carbon in this particular system, in so much as that if we compared assisted restoration, horticultural restoration, to this process-based restoration, that in time we might actually get more carbon. And so since I've last been here, we've been able to monitor this particular floodplain and to be able to then measure these different ecosystem benefits, including the groundwater recharge, including the nutrient profiles, the salmon, but importantly now the sediment profile and the amount of carbon that's actually being stored in those sediments. And so as we progress forward, you can see that combining imagery hyperspectral imagery with LiDAR and doing that in a progressive way, we can measure things that we never thought possible previously. And part of the reason for that is that it's at sea level. Change is incremental. It's difficult to discern, right? Humans know things intuitively, but without the actual data behind it, it's difficult to measure and put things in place. So we've taken a number of soil samples and biomass samples. We've done this for 20 years at this point. And we just completed a study that actually shows that this process-based restoration not only results in more stems and ultimately more diverse woody communities, but ultimately more carbon on the landscape. So this is a net carbon sink. So as we think about carbon and water and energy and biodiversity, can we take these principles that we know as ecologists and apply them in a new way when we start producing food? And so here's an example of a study where using pyrolysis to create biochar from waste from almonds. If you ever actually tried to think about how they make almond milk, there's a lot to squeeze there, but there are a lot of other byproducts that can be combined with all the dairy manure, because we have 2 million head of dairy cows, to be able to do something about methane, right? Unfortunately, our dairy farmers say that when they smell that odor, they smell money. I want to be able to change that. I don't want the smell in my neighborhood. We want to be able to reduce those methane emissions, and in this case, being able to incorporate biochar into the manure composting process, we're reducing methane emissions by 84%. Can we then incorporate photovoltaics with our agriculture? Agrivoltaics. Can we get the net benefits of the shading, the reduced temperature, better working conditions, and generate clean energy while we're producing food? I think that's possible. Someone once said, well, why don't we cover our canals? Because, there's a lot of water being evaporated in the sky. And I thought it was a bit dubious. And in some ways I still do, in the sense that the amount of just absolute infrastructure it would take to put in place. However, when we did this study, it showed something that was a bit counterintuitive. The savings from reducing evaporation was actually quite modest, right? But the cooling from the evaporation made the photovoltaic panels more efficient, so the return on the investment was actually better if you co-located these with the canals. Plus access issues, rights of way, a number of other things. There are ways to think about how technology intersects with nature that we've yet to just, really fully embrace or understand. And that's where we are today in thinking about this, right? Is across scales and across dimensions, everything from Internet of Things to what I'm calling actionable intelligence, not just artificial intelligence, but actionable intelligence. And more importantly, can we do this in a way that is inclusive so that those very communities in our region, which when they're indigenous, they might be from Latin America, they may be from Southeast Asia. We have large Hmong and Mien populations, as well as Oaxaqueños, that bring a lot of knowledge to them. And if they're working in this industry, they may actually be able to teach us a little bit about agroecology, if not how to improve technology. And the question is, can we put ecology into technology in such a way that we can all benefit from that? And so as we think about the future then, and whether it's artificial or actionable intelligence, I would just like to point out, this is a ChatGPT consumption, if you will, of Stack Overflow. So these are the people posting answers to code questions. It dropped precipitously since the chat came out, the chat bots, 3 times as much as it was before. But if you hold constant, either in Chinese or Russian, that don't have access to the chat bots, right, those have remained constant, right? So in this case, the chat bots are consuming human knowledge, right? They'll run out of knowledge. They're consuming energy, they're consuming water to cool those GPUs. Artificial intelligence on its own is not the answer, but it can give us some insights, but ultimately humans in the loop are part of that. We can decide whether to unplug it, but we can also decide what data for it to train on. And so as we look forward, in this case, I asked the chatbot about the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 20 years ago. What did it think about that today? Re-envisioned, right? And if you're familiar with that work, in the upper right quadrant was this strength from order, which unfortunately really represents where a lot of places are today, right? As opposed to the techno garden in the lower left or the mosaic in the lower right. There are these alternate futures for which we can think about. And it's that alternate future that brings me back to 2010. when I was first able to visit and collaborate with Maori researchers. And that was because my doctoral dissertation work was about vineyard impacts to salmon. Right? I like to eat salmon. It's very tasty. I like a good Pinot Noir as well. And I wanted to make sure that we could do both of those things. And I had the chance to meet the late Steve Ratton, who was, very engaged. And if I understand correctly, he had embraced this vision Mataranga in a way that I didn't really appreciate at the time, but he certainly shared it with me, connected me with the right people. And we took this concept in and around vineyards and what we were calling vinicology at the time to think about whether we could re-envision a future on that landscape. In this case, just outside of Lincoln, we were able to map a number of these different properties and assign to them a number of different values. And so this collaborative work with Dr. Simon Lambert really introduced me to the Mataranga Maori in a way that I didn't appreciate, but I do today. And we were able to encapsulate these different concepts and to be able to analyze the spatial relationships to them and ultimately to make recommendations to wine growers, not just in Aotearoa, but across the world. And so as I bring this full circle then and thinking about what a climate resilient future might look like, the building blocks for this are not technological ones. It's about health and well-being. It's about being engaged. It's about the security and sufficiency. Much like Maslow's hierarchy, it's difficult to think rationally when you're hungry, you're thirsty, or you're hurt. Right? So when we envision this world going forward, I think there's room then to think of those other worldviews that were mentioned earlier. It isn't an either-or proposition. It's an all the above, and that they can be in parallel and inform each other as we go forward. So revisiting those sacred cows and water buffaloes, I just encourage you to think about these tipping points and the decisions that we make as a society, to encourage flexibility and to encourage grace, right? To recognize that we have a responsibility, not just to this planet, but to our people. And with that, I'll say kia ora. Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Kia ora, Josh. Because you were so good and efficient, we do have time for maybe one or two questions as they come in on the app. But if I could ask you to stay up, if that's okay. In terms of sacred cows and water buffaloes, you talk a bit about media narrative and also where the power bases are. What do you notice in New Zealand that is, I guess, impacts the decision making and then I guess what we end up working on? What have you noticed? Is there anything different, or is it the same? Is it still sacred cows, water buffaloes?
No, I think that's a great question in the sense that modern media has shifted, as you well know, and the benefit of having a more engaged citizenry, and I don't call it X, I still call it Twitter, is that there's a space for communication. Unfortunately, that space can be compromised, as we well know. But I think from a scientific perspective, it opened our eyes into the sense, can we empower people to engage in ways that they hadn't previously? And we saw a study earlier today about volunteerism and the power of narrative, of engagement. And I think a lot of the tools that are being provided for citizen science, if you can couple that with things that, much like eDNA, being able to show the full meta barcode of biodiversity, things that are beyond human vision, to be able to couple those two things, I think media can actually do really well. I think when it gets distorted and creates clickbait, that's really where we start to run into some problems.
Kapai. That actually leads pretty well into this question from Bill. Fascinating presentation, Joshua. Do you have any thoughts on the opportunity to develop a chatbot to focus on all the information produced by the challenge to prove an effective knowledge transfer system?
If I understand the question correctly, yes. In so much as that the chat bots, those that have worked with them, you can train them in a number of different ways. Presently, we're working to be able to predict human behavior in and around the fallowing of land. So I mentioned previously that we were going to have to fallow about 200,000 hectares of agriculture in our region that's going to have spillover effects to our communities, to employment, to food production, any number of things. And so we believe that if we can train these bots in such a way to bring together both our values and our principles, but with the underlying information, it may provide us with some guideposts that we didn't know previously. When it comes to this korero, there's certainly a lot of opportunity there. I think there are safeguards and guardrails that need to be put in place, and it's really been shown that you only get out what you're able to put in. So that collective knowledge, whether we consider it wisdom, Mataranga Maori, like I think there are a lot of opportunities to distill then perhaps things that we didn't know previously, but all the while knowing that humans need to be in the loop as part of that decision-making process.
Tēnā rau atu koe taku rangatira, fantastic kōrero. Please put your hands together again, and thanks for Professor Joshua.